Have you ever wondered what was truly buried beneath the dust of ancient history? Could there be chapters torn from the great book of time, chapters we were never meant to read? Or perhaps it is we sleepwalkers drifting through the darkness of ages who passed over the traces, as if they had never been there at all. Empires rose and vanished without farewell. Knowledge burned, leaving no ashes. Witnesses lived and died in silence, their names erased before they were ever spoken. And in the hollow spaces between lie the things that should have been remembered, but somehow were not. Not every myth is a lie, and not every recorded truth is what truly happened. If you're still awake, if something inside you still aches with quiet curiosity, then come with me. Let us begin a journey into the greatest cover-ups of ancient history, only on deformed history. They said there was once a great library, a place where all the knowledge of the ancient world was gathered, copied, preserved, a sanctuary of scrolls of ink and flame where generations of scholars whispered across time through parchment and ash. But today there is silence, no shelves, no ashes, only the echo of a name, Alexandria. Why is it that the greatest repository of human thought simply vanished? Not just burned, not just lost, but erased. We are told it was destroyed accidentally, incidentally over time. A war here, a fire there, political turmoil, religious cleansing, so many stories, so many versions, but none of them quite settle. None of them account for the scale of what disappeared, as if the explanations themselves are part of the fire, as if they were written to smother the smoke. How do you lose 500,000 scrolls? How do you lose the memory of those who guarded them? Some claim Julius Caesar was to blame, setting fire to enemy ships docked in the harbor and letting the flames consume the city's heart. Others point to Christian zealots erasing pagan texts in a sacred purge. Still others name the caliphate in later centuries, turning ancient wisdom to tinder. But beneath each tale lies a deeper question. Who benefited from the loss? What did the library truly contain? They say it wasn't just Greek philosophy and Egyptian astronomy. That tucked among the scrolls were older fragments, Atlantean myths copied from stone Babylonian maps of the stars, Egyptian records of pre-dynastic rulers with lifespans too long to believe. Documents that didn't just challenge history, they unstitched it. Were there maps of lands no longer on any globe? Were there treatises on energy matter healing, the kind of knowledge that would seem like sorcery to the empires that followed? The historian Strabo once wrote that the library was part of a larger dream, the Mausion, an institute of learning culture exchange, a place where all paths of thought met. If true, then it was more than a building. It was a convergence of timelines, tongues, cosmologies, and if such a place existed, truly existed, then its destruction was not a loss. It was a silencing. But silence speaks, especially when it follows so suddenly after centuries of accumulation. Have you noticed how little remains? Not just of the scrolls, but of the lives of those who wrote, translated, protected them. Where are their tombs, their letters, their names? Could it be that more than paper was burned? The philosopher Hypatia, the last great thinker of Alexandria, was murdered in public, her body torn apart by a mob. It was the year 415. They say it was political. They say it was religious. But it was also symbolic. The death of inquiry, the final ember snuffed. And yet, something resists the forgetting. Fragments survive in strange places. A papyrus here, a carved symbol there. Languages that should not resemble one another, echoing across continents. And in those echoes we hear the faint murmur of what might have been. The modern mind is trained to see coincidence, to explain away the impossible. But what if some patterns are not imagined? What if the reason we know so little about the ancient world is not because time failed to preserve it, but because someone made sure we wouldn't? Who would do that? A conqueror fears rival empires. A priest fears forbidden truth. A ruler fears a population that thinks for itself. So if there was knowledge, dangerous knowledge in that library knowledge that empowered the many over the few, perhaps its disappearance was not random at all. What if the fire was only the beginning? Think of this: in the centuries that followed, we were taught to start over, from scratch. The Renaissance rediscovered Aristotle as if he'd only just spoken. Copernicus broke a silence that had already been broken millennia before. Medicine, astronomy, geometry, all reinvented as though the library had never lived. But the foundations had been there. Once. Do we really believe that such a place died, without seed? Or do we carry pieces of it unknowingly in the myths we call fiction, in the instincts we dismiss as coincidence? There's a story, half dismissed, half whispered, of a secret society descended from the library's last custodians. Not powerful, not political, just remembering. Passing fragments across generations, hiding truths in art, in song, in dreams. Guardians of something older than memory. It sounds like fantasy, but so does a library that held the blueprints of the world. And still we sleep. We accept the silence. We tell ourselves the fire was an accident, the loss inevitable. But if you listen closely, beneath the surface of every ancient manuscript, behind the eyes of every weathered statue, there is a quiet question lingering. What if the Library of Alexandria did not die, but was buried? What if what we lost is still waiting to be found? They say the Library of Alexandria may have been the final resting place of forbidden knowledge. But where did that knowledge come from? Who wrote the scrolls before the scrolls, whose symbols echoed through time, long before hieroglyphs etched their first breath? Beneath the sands of Egypt, older than the pyramids, older than dynasties, there are ruins that refuse to speak their names. Structures so precise they defy erosion, foundations so ancient they no longer belong to any known people. And yet they stand silent, waiting, half buried in centuries of dust and denial. The Temple of Osirian at Abydos is one such place. While tourists marvel at its granite pillars and subterranean chambers, few question the riddle carved into its very stone. Why does this temple appear older than the structures built atop it? Why is its architecture cyclopean, as if shaped by hands that no longer exist? Egyptologists file it under ritual significance and move on. But if you pause, if you truly look, the Osirian does not ask to be explained. It demands to be remembered. What civilization built a temple that aligns with the stars of Orion's belt? Not now, but as they appeared over 10,000 years ago. How could anyone know that unless they had been watching? Then, there are other whispers of water damage on the walls of the Sphinx, of erosion patterns that suggest rainfall in a desert that hasn't seen storms since the Ice Age. Scholars like John Anthony West and geologist Robert Schoch challenged the timeline. They said this statue is older than Egypt itself. But the academic world closed ranks, Credentials were questioned, theories dismissed. The textbook version held firm the Sphinx is no older than 2500 BCE. Anything else is myth. And yet the anomalies remain. Weather does not lie. Imagine a civilization that existed before what we call history. A culture erased not by conquest, but by time and flood. A people whose monuments were swallowed by the rising seas, whose stories were scattered like ash across continents. Does that sound familiar? Atlantis. The word itself feels radioactive. To mention it is to risk being laughed out of lecture halls. And yet, Plato did not present Atlantis as allegory. He described it with the detail of a historian. A land beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a mighty power that sank in a single night and day of misfortune. He even gave it a date 9,000 years before Solon. Why would Plato, revered for logic and philosophy, invent a story so precise if it were meant only as metaphor? Some believe Atlantis was never a single island, but a network, a prehistoric world culture connected by sea, by sky, by symbols we still don't understand. And perhaps, just perhaps, fragments of that culture survived, passed down, hidden in temples we misattribute, preserved in scrolls that later found their way to Alexandria. If so, then the library wasn't just a place of learning, it was a vault, a safeguard for something older, something powerful, something dangerous to those who built their kingdoms on silence. This is not just about lost knowledge, it is about the right to remember. The Dogon people of Mali, for instance, hold oral traditions dating back thousands of years. They speak of a star, Sirius B, that cannot be seen with the naked eye. They knew its orbit, its density, its twin, long before telescopes, long before science could confirm their stories. Where did they learn that? Is it coincidence or continuity? The more you look, the more cracks appear in the narrative we've been given. Cultures with no contact building pyramids with near-identical geometry. Deities with the same symbols, the same tools appearing across continents. Myths of a great flood, told in every language on every shore. Are these coincidences or echoes? What if the Osirian and the Sphinx, the Dogon, and the drowned cities off the coast of India are not isolated anomalies, but survivors of a greater whole? And what if that whole was dismantled, not by nature, but by design? To erase a civilization is to erase its memory. But to erase its memory, you must also control what comes next. Control the story. Control the history. Control the schools, the temples, the libraries. And so we return again to Alexandria, not as a beginning, but as a terminus, the end of one story to make space for another. A sanitized history, one with clean edges and clear timelines. One that begins in Mesopotamia, rises with Greece, and culminates in Rome. Convenient, predictable, controlled. But real history is not clean. It is jagged, chaotic, bleeding through the gaps we try so hard to patch. There is a reason we are drawn to ancient ruins, a reason we feel something stir in the gut when standing beneath monoliths no one can explain. It's not nostalgia, it's recognition. We remember what we've been told to forget. And maybe that's the true threat. Not the knowledge itself, but the remembering. Because memory breeds questions. And questions unravel the narratives that keep us asleep. So the question now is not whether an ancient civilization once existed. The question is, Who wanted us to forget? Across deserts, jungles, and forgotten valleys, something repeats. Stone, angle, precision, alignment. There is a rhythm to the Earth's surface, and it beats beneath ancient pyramids, structures that should not know each other yet do. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, the pyramids of Nubia, of Cambodia, of China's Forbidden Plains, all scattered, all silent, and all eerily similar. We are told they were built independently, that these were coincidences born of necessity, that stacking stone upward was simply the most stable way to build. But is stability alone enough to explain their complexity? And why do so many of these monuments align with the stars? Who taught distant cultures to carve stone with mathematical precision in isolation? Or were they never truly isolated? The Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, is aligned almost perfectly to true north. Its base is a near-perfect square. The dimensions encode the golden ratio pi and even the curvature of the earth. It is not merely a tomb, because oddly no pharaoh has ever been found inside. So, what was it? At Teotihuacan in Mexico, thousands of miles away, another pyramid rises wider than Giza's and equally aligned. Beneath it, archaeologists have found mercury flowing through channels and mysterious spheres arranged beneath the temple like stars. Mercury, the same element found in small quantities in ancient Chinese tombs and rumored in tales of Indian vimanas, flying craft of legend. Why mercury? Why pyramids? Why the same sacred geometry? These are not random patterns. They are signatures. They are fingerprints of a knowledge older than any one nation. And they ask us a question we've been trained not to ask. What connects these places? We are told there was no contact between Egypt and Mesoamerica, that the oceans were too vast, the cultures too distinct. But then we find maize in ancient India, cocaine in Egyptian mummies, artifacts out of place, seeds where they shouldn't be, and statues, so many statues with faces that seem to belong to another continent entirely. Were our ancestors global before we were? And if so, why erase that fact? Perhaps because a civilization that navigated the oceans, mapped the stars, and built monuments that still outlast us, such a civilization doesn't fit our story. It doesn't fit the image of early humanity as primitive, fractured crawling slowly toward progress. It would mean that the arc of history bends backward, that we are not the peak, but the echo. Consider the pyramids of China, tall, grassy mounds hidden from public view. For decades, their existence was denied, then downplayed, and now largely ignored. Access is restricted, excavation is minimal. What are they protecting? Or rather, what are they protecting us from knowing? There's a curious detail about these pyramids. Some are aligned with Orion's belt, just like Giza, just like the Osirian. Why do ancient builders across millennia keep looking to the same constellation? Orion is the hunter. In myth, he chases immortality. In stone, he seems to mark a path, a celestial map guiding the dead, or perhaps the living toward a truth written not in books, but in light. Some researchers believe these structures once formed a global network, a grid of energy consciousness or information now long dormant. Ley lines, Earth's subtle currents, places of resonance. If true, then the pyramids were not tombs. but tuning forks. They sang with the earth, and someone silenced them. What would happen if they were activated again? Would we hear the song, or would we remember? Modern science dismisses this. There is no evidence, they say. But what counts as evidence? A stone, a satellite scan, a feeling in your chest when standing beneath a structure older than time. And if so many of these monuments were destroyed, buried, or sealed, what does that say about their importance? There are pyramids beneath the sea. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, steps carved into stone columns shaped by something more than waves. And in the waters off Cuba and India, sonar has revealed geometric shapes. Cities swallowed whole. Why do we fear this story? Is it because it collapses everything we've been told? That Egypt was first. That writing began in Sumer. That the Americas slept in isolation until Columbus knocked. These are neat stories. They serve power. They place us in control. But real history is not neat. It is tangled. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we are not meant to believe in a time before time, in a civilization of engineers and dreamers who built temples to the sky. Maybe that truth was buried beneath stone and wave on purpose so that we could begin again. Blind. But then, why do the monuments remain? Why do they keep calling? Every time we try to forget, the earth reveals another clue, a structure too precise, a tablet too advanced, a pattern that doesn't fit. It's as if something or someone wants to be remembered. The pyramids are not just symbols of death. They are anchors, messages across time. And as we continue to ignore them, to explain them away, to label them coincidence, we miss the larger message. That history is not a straight line. It loops, it spirals, it sings beneath stone. And somewhere beneath all the sand and denial, an old truth waits. If we ever dare to ask the right question, they say language is the memory of a civilization. But what happens when languages that should have never met speak the same words? Look closely at the carvings on temples in Central America, at the symbols etched on stones in the Indus Valley, at the sacred markings buried deep in Siberia, the Andes, the Pacific. Different peoples, different tongues, different gods. And yet, the shapes repeat. A spiral, a cross within a circle, a feathered serpent, a hand with 6 fingers. They echo through time like whispers across a great canyon, separated by oceans, by mountains, by the rigid certainty of modern history, and still they hum the same tune. Is this the result of parallel evolution? Or is it the residue of a forgotten mother tongue? Archaeologists often shrug. They say these symbols are universal sun, moon, birth, death, archetypes of the collective mind. But even Jung, who gave us the term collective unconscious, hinted that archetypes may be inherited, not imagined, passed down, rooted in something real. So what if these symbols are not just motifs, but memories? In the Andes, the Inca spoke of Viracocha, a bearded god who came from the sea, taught wisdom, and vanished into the sky. Thousands of miles away, the Sumerians revered Enki, lord of the deep, master of knowledge, bearer of gifts. In Egypt, Thoth wrote the secrets of the universe. In India, Shiva danced time itself. Different names, same essence, the bringer of light, the guardian of language, the destroyer and the rebuilder. How do these myths persist across civilizations that, according to textbooks, had no means of contact. And how do these cultures all claim the same thing? That the knowledge was given. Not developed, not invented, given. By who? Some say extraterrestrials, others say gods. But maybe the truth is simpler and stranger. Maybe there was a people before us, a culture so old, so vast, that its fingerprints became mythology, that its tongue, its symbols, its geometry still linger in the deepest layers of our collective mind. Like dreams we inherited, like songs we never learned but somehow remember. There's a stone in Colombia, El Infernito, the little hell. It holds solar alignments. Beneath it, bones are buried with heads facing east. Across the world in Nabta Playa, long before Stonehenge, ancient Africans arranged stones to mark the solstices. In Newgrange, Ireland, a passage grave captures the light of the rising sun once a year for minutes. Then darkness again. Why did the ancients build so much for the sky? Was it faith or was it memory? Did they know something we've forgotten? We once thought writing began in Sumer around 3200 BCE. Then the Indus script appeared undeciphered but just as old. Then Rongorongo on Easter Island. Then the Vincha symbols in the Balkans dated to 5000 BCE. And still older, Göbekli Tepe. Carvings, patterns, messages. No one agrees. 'Cause we don't want to. To acknowledge a global symbolic language means acknowledging a shared origin. A center. A beginning before the beginning. One that may not sit comfortably with our current chronology. But the patterns are there. Consider the number 432. It appears again and again. In Vedic cosmology. In Norse myth. In the dimensions of ancient temples. Halve it, quarter it, double it repeats. A resonance, a frequency, a code. Is this coincidence? Or is it structure? Even today, musicians know that 432 Hz feels different, sounds warmer, more natural. Some claim it resonates with the earth. Others say the tuning was deliberately changed to 440 Hz to disrupt that harmony. A conspiracy, perhaps, but the fact remains ancient monuments seem to be built in tune. So who were the original builders? Who left us this architecture of symbols? And why did they vanish? Or did they? Some esoteric traditions speak of the Watchers, the Shemsu Hor, the 7 sages, the Apkallu, always 7, always bearers of knowledge, always retreating after the flood. Yes, the flood. Every culture remembers the water, the rising sea, the swallowed cities, the floating vessels that saved a few. It's the one story we all share. But floods erase. They do not explain the synchronization of what remains. Why is the zodiac the same across continents? Why do temples point to Sirius, to Orion, to the Pleiades? Why do myths speak of visitors from the stars, not as aliens, but as ancestors? What if they were not aliens in the way Hollywood imagines, but a people with knowledge beyond what we allow ancient minds to hold? Not from another planet, from another age. A golden age, some say, the Satya Yuga, the time before time. And what if they knew the world would forget that fire flood, and fear would break the chain, so they seeded the memory, in stone, in myth, in symbols we'd rediscover when we were ready? Are we, or do we still flinch from the truth? Because the truth does not flatter. It does not make us the first or the most advanced. It makes us the amnesiacs, wandering through the ruins of a world we once knew, pretending we built it all ourselves. But deep down we feel it. In the quiet, in the stillness, in the questions we dare not ask aloud. Why do we remember what we never learned? Why do ancient symbols feel like home? And why do they keep finding their way back? Somewhere around 12,800 years ago, something shattered the sky. The earth trembled. The ice caps melted in a blink. Oceans rose. Cities, if they existed, were swallowed without a sound. And in every ancient tradition, in every corner of the globe, a single story remained: the Great Flood. It's tempting to call it myth, a metaphor, a universal way to speak about change or punishment or rebirth. But what if it wasn't just a symbol? What if it was memory? Geologists now speak of the Younger Dryas, a sudden violent shift in climate. Something ended the last ice age, not with a slow thaw, but with catastrophe. The most accepted theory, a comet, or fragments of one, slamming into North America, triggering wildfires across continents, sending shockwaves through the planet's delicate systems. They call it the Clovis Comet hypothesis, and for years it was ignored. But the evidence grew layers of black soil full of nanodiamonds, platinum, and soot traces of impact of inferno. Melted glass. An extinction event. Was this the moment the world reset? Plato claimed Atlantis fell in a single night and day of floods and fire. He even gave it a date around 9600 BCE, almost precisely the onset of the Younger Dryas. Coincidence? Or convergence? If this event did happen, if a comet struck, if oceans rose, if the sky burned, then what did we lose? What existed before? Modern history tells us not much. Nomadic tribes, simple tools, scattered settlements, no cities, no architecture, no writing. But then, there is Göbekli Tepe, a site in Turkey, buried deliberately. Megalithic stone circles older than any known temple, carvings of animals some extinct, symbols, geometry, alignment, and on one pillar, a sky map, one that some researchers believe shows a comet impact in the constellation Sagittarius around 10,900 BCE. If true, then Göbekli Tepe is not just a temple. It's a warning. Who built it? How, and more importantly, why did they bury it? To protect it or to protect us? You see, the flood myth isn't just a tale of destruction. It's a story of forgetting, of survival, of knowledge slipping beneath the waves. In every culture there are survivors, the chosen, the guided, the lucky few. In Sumer, it was Ziusudra. In the Bible, Noah. In India, Manu. In Mesoamerica, Coxcox and Xochiquetzal. Different names, same escape. And always, the same aftermath. The survivors are told to rebuild, to restart, but never to remember. Why? What if forgetting was part of the design? Because if the flood wiped out not just life but memory, then humanity was reborn with no past. A blank slate, easy to shape, easy to control. And yet the memories still leak through. Stone structures too advanced for their time. Oral traditions that speak of stars and cycles. Languages that seem to rise from nowhere, already complete. Maps from the 1500s showing Antarctica's true coastline under the ice, before we even knew it existed. How? Where did this residual knowledge come from? Some suggest a lost civilization, not Atlantis as fantasy, but as placeholder, a real people, global, seafaring, scientific, perhaps not bound by the tools we expect bronze iron, but by other methods, harmonics, resonance, light. Their cities may have stood where oceans now ripple, off the coasts of India, Cuba, Japan, submerged ruins barely spoken of, dismissed, inconvenient, and yet still there. If such a civilization existed, it would threaten everything we teach, every timeline, every structure of progress. So instead, we call the flood myth. We call the comet a hypothesis. We pretend the world before the flood never was. But myths don't survive thousands of years without reason. They evolve, they distort. But at their core, they hold truth. Truth encoded in story, in symbol, in ritual. And the truth of the flood is not just water. It's silence. A sudden global silence in the record. No writing, no ruins, no trace. And yet humanity begins again, as if waking from amnesia. Why do we accept this? Why do we believe the human brain, a structure as complex as the universe, emerged from nothing learned to speak, write, build, worship, in a few thousand years? What if it remembered how? What if civilization is not linear but cyclical? What if we've risen and fallen more than once? Ancient Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, ages of man, from the Golden Age to the Kali Yuga, a cycle of rise, decline, and destruction, echoed in the Hopi traditions, in the Aztec suns, in Norse Ragnarok. Always a pattern, always a reset, and always a warning. If the flood was one such reset, what came before it may still be buried, waiting. Not just beneath the sea, but beneath our assumptions. So perhaps the question isn't whether a great flood happened. Perhaps the question is, what truths drowned with it? Sometimes the most dangerous thing is not what we forget, but what we are told to ignore. Throughout the world, in dusty museum basements and private collections, there are artifacts silent, strange, and completely out of place. Pieces that don't belong in the neat puzzle of our accepted history. Objects that whisper of technologies too advanced, metals too pure, and knowledge too refined for the times they supposedly came from. They call them parts, out-of-place artifacts. And whenever one surfaces, it disappears just as quickly, dismissed, discredited, or quietly shelved. Take the Antikythera mechanism. Discovered in 1901 off the coast of Greece, it sat corroded in a box for decades. Only later did researchers realize what they had found: a complex mechanical computer from the 2nd century BCE. Gears, dials, calculations of lunar cycles and eclipses. Nothing like it appeared in our history again for another 1,000 years. How is that possible? Why would such a device exist in isolation? Who built it, and why was its knowledge lost? We're told it was a fluke, a one-off. But the craftsmanship suggests mastery, and mastery never begins with a single object. So what happened to the others? Elsewhere in Colombia, small gold figurines were found in ancient tombs. They look like insects at first, until you study the wings, the tail rudders, the cockpit shape. Modern aeronautical engineers have built scale models of these artifacts, and they fly. They call them zoomorphic, decorative, symbolic. But to pilots and physicists, they are more than that. They are schematics, worn as jewelry by people who supposedly had no concept of flight. Coincidence or memory? And then there are the spheres. In South Africa, deep within Precambrian rock, over 2.8 billion years old, miners discovered metallic spheres with etched grooves running perfectly along their circumference. Scientists argue over their origin. Some say they are naturally formed, others are not so sure. Because nature does not carve parallel lines into polished metal. What are these spheres? And how do we explain them without breaking the timeline? In 1936 near Baghdad, a small clay jar was found. Inside an iron rod surrounded by copper. It was a battery, over 2,000 years old. Known now as the Baghdad Battery, it suggests knowledge of electrochemistry long before Benjamin Franklin flew his kite. Again, we are told it was a coincidence, perhaps used for simple electroplating. But why make batteries if you don't know what electricity is? Over and over we find the same pattern. An object appears that challenges the official story, and instead of rethinking the story, we remove the object. Why? Who decides what belongs in history and what doesn't? Museums are not neutral. They are curators of a narrative. Institutions built not only to preserve the past, but to present a version of it, one that supports a certain worldview, one that confirms progress as linear civilization as recent and modernity as triumphant. But history is not a straight line. It loops, it folds, it forgets, and sometimes it remembers too much. What if some of these artifacts weren't accidents? What if they were left intentionally by a prior civilization, breadcrumbs? Not for us to worship, but to awaken. A message in the metal, a whisper in the wires. In India's ancient texts, the Vedas, there are descriptions of flying machines called vimanas. They had engines, fuel pilots. They waged wars in the sky. To some, it's myth. To others, it's memory distorted by time. And then we find these gold figurines, and suddenly, the line between story and science begins to blur. Why are we afraid of that blur? Because it threatens the structure. The carefully arranged ladder of progress. If ancient humans harnessed flight or electricity, or even atomic power, as some fringe researchers suggest, then we are not evolving. We are recovering. And someone doesn't want us to realize that. Who? Academia guards its borders fiercely. And that's not a conspiracy, it's survival. Entire careers are built upon assumptions, grants, tenure, recognition. To admit a major flaw in the story is to risk collapse. So when the story doesn't fit, it's easier to discard the evidence than to face the implications. Even well-meaning historians play this game. They aren't villains, but they're part of a system that rewards certainty over curiosity. And in that system, there is no room for anomalies. But anomalies are where the truth hides, not in the volumes repeated year after year, but in the margins, the footnotes, the objects without labels, the stories that end in ellipses. And that's where we must look, because the greatest cover-ups don't happen in secret rooms. They happen in plain sight, in the halls of museums, in the silence of textbooks, in the way we are taught to laugh at the strange and cling to the safe. But what if the strange is the signal? What if these artifacts are not errors, but echoes of a time before time, of knowledge not lost but hidden, of a world not primitive but purged? The deeper question isn't whether these objects are real. The deeper question is, why are we not allowed to wonder? The Library of Alexandria is not the only silence. There were others. Libraries that once held the world's forgotten languages, its forbidden truths, its dangerous dreams. Places where parchment met prophecy, and where secrets did not merely collect dust, they waited. And one by one these libraries vanished. Some in fire, some in war, some in ways no one can explain. It begins with Nineveh. In the ruins of the Assyrian Empire beneath the palace of King Ashurbanipal, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets, cuneiform etched deep into hardened mud, meticulously organized. An ancient system of cataloging, an archive. Among those tablets, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a flood story older than the Bible. But that's not all. There were astronomical texts, medical instructions, lists of kings stretching back tens of thousands of years. Too far, some say. So far back they had to be myth. But myths don't count time in centuries. They count in cycles. The Sumerian king list, one of those recovered texts, names rulers who reigned for 28,000, 36,000, even 43,000 years. The translators shrugged. Symbolic, they said. They couldn't have meant it literally. But what if they did? And what if that was the point of the library, to remember what others wanted to forget? Ashurbanipal himself boasted, "I have read the obscure tablets from before the flood. Not written, not imagined. Read." He had access to texts even then considered ancient, worn with age, surviving something cataclysmic. Where did they come from? And where are they now? Because most of the library of Nineveh was destroyed. Invasions, looting, time. Today only fragments remain, enough to tantalize, never enough to confirm. History buried in plain sight. Then there's the library of Pergamon, once rival to Alexandria. Its scrolls were said to number in the hundreds of thousands. They developed a new form of writing material, parchment. Animal skin, durable, meant to last. But the library was dismantled, its contents shipped away as spoils. No one knows exactly where. Some say to Alexandria. Others say they disappeared. We are told not to ask too many questions. And yet the pattern continues. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established in the 9th century. A beacon of translation astronomy mathematics. Arabic scholars preserved Greek knowledge, Indian cosmology, Persian alchemy. For a moment in time, it was a convergence, a rebirth of science. And then, in 1258, the Mongols came. They sacked the city, threw the books into the Tigris River. The water ran black with ink for days. That's the story. But some say it was not only destruction, that some books were taken, moved, hidden. Why? Because knowledge is power, and power unguarded becomes a threat. So libraries like temples must be guarded or burned. Timbuktu, once a center of learning in West Africa. Thousands of manuscripts in astronomy, medicine, law, and mysticism, all written in Arabic Songhai Fulani. In the 21st century, many of them still hidden, buried in trunks, passed down in secret. Why secret? Because colonizers dismissed African history as oral primitive without record. And so, the records were hidden. Even now, efforts to digitize these manuscripts meet quiet resistance. Funding cuts, bureaucracy, silence. As if someone somewhere prefers the narrative remain blank. A history of forgetting. But these libraries tell a different story. They suggest that knowledge once flowed freely, that it was collected, preserved, exchanged across cultures, across languages, across centuries, and then systematically cut off. Because information disrupts, especially when it doesn't fit. What if the real story of civilization was woven through these libraries? What if each one held a piece of something older, older than kings, older than conquest? Not just philosophy, but memory. Not just science, but instruction. From where, from whom? Some believe a core tradition ran through all of them. An initiatory knowledge, a kind of code embedded in the symbols preserved in rituals encrypted in stories. The Hermetica, the Emerald Tablet, the Book of Thoth, texts whispered about never fully found. The thread runs faint, but it runs. In every ancient library there are hints of this lost wisdom, a math that merges with spirit, a cosmology that mirrors the self, a science of vibration, the power of sound, the geometry of consciousness. And always warnings. Warnings about forgetting, about cycles, about falling asleep in the dream of power. Maybe that's why the libraries were destroyed. Not to erase data, but to erase awakening. Because when people remember who they are, the old structures crumble. Control depends on amnesia. And so we burn the libraries. We erase the names. We build new towers from the ashes and call it progress. But a few always survive. A page, a fragment, a word, enough to reignite the spark. So maybe the question isn't, where did all the ancient knowledge go? Maybe the question is, who's still keeping it hidden? There are stories that never reach the light of day, not because they are forgotten, but because they are protected. In the shadow of empires, behind the facades of temples and cathedrals cloaked in symbols the public never learns to read. There are societies that have quietly kept a flame alive, a flame of memory, a flicker of something older than nation, older than dogma, older than recorded time. Some call them cults, others guardians, but to history they are ghosts. The mystery schools of Egypt, the Pythagoreans of Greece, the Essenes of Judea, the Gnostics, the Hermetics, the Sufis, always secret, always scattered, and always whispering the same thing, that truth is not lost, it is veiled. What were they guarding? Why the secrecy? We are told these orders studied philosophy, geometry, music, astronomy, but not in the way modern minds do. For them, numbers were not quantities, they were qualities, frequencies, symbols. The triangle wasn't just a shape, it was a doorway, a resonance, a key. To what? To themselves, to the universe, to something beneath the surface of things. Initiates were sworn to silence. Knowledge was revealed only in stages. Not because it was dangerous to know, but because it was dangerous to misuse. And yet many of these orders vanished, purged, absorbed, erased. The Library of Alexandria may have burned, but its scribes, its keepers, may have simply gone underground. Hidden in plain sight. There are fragments, just fragments of what they taught. In the Emerald Tablet, said to be written by Hermes Trismegistus, a single line echoes across the ages, as above, so below. A mirror, a law, a reminder that the cosmos is reflected in us, and that to know the stars is to know the self. But this was heresy to rising empires, dangerous. Because when truth becomes inner, it can't be taxed. It can't be policed. It can't be shaped into dogma. And so these teachings were hunted. The Gnostics, with their belief in hidden realms and corrupt creators, were wiped from the early Christian narrative, branded as heretics, burned. Their texts buried in jars beneath the Egyptian sand, only rediscovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi. Why now? Why were we allowed to find them after nearly 2,000 years? Was it accident or timing? Some say these texts were never meant for the past. They were seeded for the future, for a generation that would begin to remember. Remember what? That history is not linear, that knowledge is not owned, That power built on forgetting is always brittle. The Essenes, a reclusive Jewish sect near the Dead Sea, left behind scrolls of extraordinary complexity, astronomy calendars, codes, visions. Among them, a text called the Book of Secrets. The title alone is a whisper. Why did they choose isolation? Were they hiding or preserving? Even the Knights Templar, those infamous warrior monks of the Crusades, were accused not just of heresy, but of possession of something ancient, something buried beneath Solomon's temple. They rose quickly, amassed wealth, land influence, and then were eradicated almost overnight. Their leaders tortured, their secrets never recovered. And still, the symbols remained. In cathedrals, in art, in architecture, a hidden language passed through generations, quietly, patiently. The rose window, the eight-pointed star, the Vesica Piscis, sacred geometry encrypted in stone and glass, not decoration, but invocation. Was it beauty, or was it code? Even today, traces of these orders persist. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Theosophists, stripped of power perhaps, but still carrying echoes of something older. Rituals repeated without full understanding. Symbols worn without translation. But someone somewhere still knows what they mean. And perhaps not all of them are on the same side. Because secrecy cuts both ways. It can preserve, and it can control. What if the same mechanisms used to guard ancient truths were turned to keep them hidden forever? What if those who once protected the flame became gatekeepers deciding who is worthy, who is ready, and who must be kept in the dark? Can knowledge be sacred and still be hoarded? Can wisdom liberate if locked behind ritual and bloodlines? We may romanticize these secret schools, but what if some became corrupted? What if over centuries their purpose shifted from remembrance to power? Not all torch-bearers seek to light the way. Some only guard the fire. So when we ask, where did the knowledge go? We must also ask, who took it and who benefits from its absence? Because while we search the ruins of temples and the depths of oceans, the real vaults may lie beneath cities, beneath institutions, beneath beliefs. Protected, hidden, or worse, misused. In a world of distraction, the greatest secret may not be what is buried. It may be what's been hidden in plain sight. A gesture, a pattern, a number, and maybe you've seen it too. That feeling, that moment, when something doesn't quite fit but feels familiar. No déjà vu, but reawakening. A thread pulled loose from the veil. What if you're not just a seeker? What if you're a rememberer? And what if the societies we call secret have always known you'd return? Maps are supposed to tell us where we are, but sometimes they show us where we're not supposed to go. Before GPS, before satellites, before even compasses and sextants, there were maps, drawn by hand, etched by memory, passed between explorers, merchants, priests. Maps weren't just tools, they were stories. And like all stories, some pages were erased. One of the strangest is the Piri Reis map. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, it shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and a stretch of Antarctica. Not just the tip, but its actual ice-free coastline. Here's the thing, Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and its subglacial topography wasn't fully mapped until the 20th century using radar and satellite imaging. So how did a map from the 1500s get it right? Piri Reis claimed his map was based on earlier sources now lost. Some say they came from the Library of Alexandria. Others whisper older names: Atlantis, Lemuria, the pre-flood world. Whatever the origin, the detail is uncanny. Even the U.S. Air Force studied it in the 1960s and concluded the coastline was real, but it's been under ice for at least 6,000 years. So who mapped it when it wasn't frozen? And more importantly, why is no one talking about it? Because this isn't just about a map. It's about memory and who controls it. The Piri Reis map isn't alone. There's the Zeno map drawn in the 14th century, showing parts of Greenland ice-free. The Orontius Phineas map from 1531, again depicting Antarctica, without ice with rivers and mountains exposed. The Boache map. The Mercator charts. Again and again, the same anomaly appears, a familiarity with coastlines that should have been unknowable. Is it coincidence, forgery, fantasy? Or did someone know the world before the ice returned? If so, the implications are vast. It means that seafaring cultures existed long before our timeline allows, that they sailed the globe, charted it, left behind clues, but something erased them. A flood, a reset, a deliberate forgetting. And we were told to start over, to believe that Columbus discovered the Americas, that Magellan circled the globe first, that we were the brave pioneers. But the maps suggest otherwise. They suggest we were remembering, not discovering. And maybe that's why they don't teach us about them, because they break the script. Cartography is political, always has been. The edges of maps define borders, claims, legitimacy. But when the map itself becomes a threat, when it speaks of knowledge too old, too precise, it becomes a target for erasure. You won't find the Piri Reis map in your school books. You'll find it tucked away in archives. Footnoted, discredited, not disproven, just dismissed. Is that science or censorship? In the Pacific, old Polynesian star charts guided navigators across thousands of miles without instruments. Oral maps passed through chant and gesture. Western explorers were stunned. These weren't primitive islanders. They were master astronomers. Again, the narrative had to bend or break. Even in the Middle Ages, T&O maps dominated Europe, circular centered around Jerusalem, distorted to fit theology. The real world was reshaped to match belief. So what if the maps we trust today are still distorted? Not by accident, but by design. Think about the idea of terra incognita, unknown lands. Blank spaces filled with monsters, dragons warnings. Those weren't just artistic flourishes. They were barriers, warnings not to look further. What if some of those lands were real? What if they were simply not meant for you? What if knowledge of their existence was kept for the few? There are whispers that certain elite families, secret orders, or high-level institutions have access to unredacted maps, ones that show features you'll never see on Google Earth. Islands that shouldn't be there. Mountains that shift. Ocean trenches with structure. Fantasy, or a different layer of reality hidden beneath ours. Maps are mirrors, and these mirrors reflect something uncomfortable, that we may not be the first to chart the earth, that others came before, that their knowledge survived, just not for everyone. And this leads to a chilling thought. If old maps were suppressed, what else has been? Satellite imagery is now censored. Areas are blurred. Coordinates scrubbed. Try looking for certain Arctic zones, deep ocean ridges, or parts of Antarctica. You'll find gaps, static, edits. Why? National security, they say, strategic secrecy. But perhaps it's not about military, perhaps it's about memory. Because if the Piri race map is even partially true, then everything we know about early civilization collapses, and someone somewhere has a vested interest in keeping the old world buried. Not physically, but cognitively. We were taught the Earth was flat, then round, then spinning in space. We were told the world was small, then vast, then mapped and mastered. But the more we learn, the less we seem to know. The map folds in on itself, and the edges fray, and somewhere beyond the known lies something waiting, not a place, but a truth. And maybe we're not ready to see it. Not because we can't handle it, but because those who came before us were never meant to be remembered. They were erased not out of malice, but out of fear. Because if we remember them, we might become them. So the next time you look at a map, ask yourself, what's missing? What was once there? And who decided you shouldn't know? There's a place on Earth more mysterious than any jungle, desert, or mountain range. A place we cannot live, cannot easily explore, cannot fully explain. Antarctica. White, silent, imposing, and sealed. At first glance, it's just ice. Endless, frozen, inhospitable. A continent wrapped in storms and silence. But the closer you look, the stranger it becomes. Because Antarctica doesn't behave like other places. For one, it's the only continent governed by treaty, a pact signed in 1959 by 12 countries including rivals in the Cold War. A treaty that prohibits military activity, limits access, and freezes territorial claims. To this day, over 60 nations have agreed no colonization, no ownership, no digging without permission. Why? What makes this frozen land so special? Or so dangerous? The official answer is environmental protection, scientific cooperation, peaceful research. But what if that's just the surface? Because beneath the miles of ice, something stirs. Satellite images. Some now classified, others quietly removed, have revealed anomalies. Straight lines, geometric ridges, thermal signatures. In a land sculpted by chaos, these shapes shouldn't exist. In 2002, a team drilling through Lake Vostok, hidden beneath 2 miles of ice, stopped abruptly. The reason classified. The samples sealed. Rumors spread of strange microbes, magnetic anomalies, even signs of structure beneath the ice shelf. But nothing was confirmed. And then, silence. Antarctica's past is a ghost. According to mainstream geology, it was once green, lush, full of forests, rivers, and possibly life. Millions of years ago, they say. But then the poles shifted, the climate changed, and the continent froze. But what if it didn't freeze slowly? What if it froze all at once? Charles Hapgood, a professor supported in part by Albert Einstein, proposed that Earth's crust can shift rapidly, displacing entire continents in a matter of days or weeks. A crustal displacement, not a slow drift. If true, then Antarctica could have been tropical, within human memory. And then it froze. Not over millennia, but in a geological instant. Flash frozen. If that happened, anything living or built there would still be underneath. Preserved, untouched, waiting. Some suggest that the legends of Atlantis point not to the Atlantic, but to the south. That a technologically advanced civilization once thrived in what is now Antarctica. And when disaster struck, they vanished, buried beneath ice and myth. Too far-fetched. Then why do governments continue to restrict access? Why are there no commercial flights over the interior? Why are research stations monitored, compartmentalized, isolated? In 2016, then Secretary of State John Kerry made a sudden unexplained trip to Antarctica on Election Day. No reason given, just presence. A few months later, Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill followed. Again, no clear explanation. Spiritual leaders, political figures, scientists, all drawn to the same frozen edge of the world. Are they seeking ice or something hidden within it? In 1995, the European remote sensing satellite detected a heat signature beneath the ice in Wilkes Land, about 151 miles wide. Researchers proposed it could be an asteroid impact site, but the data showed something else, a gravitational anomaly. Something massive, dense, artificial. No one followed up, at least not publicly. The Nazi regime in the 1930s sent expeditions to Antarctica. They claimed a swath of land, Neuschwabenland. There were rumors of underground bases, secret operations, escape routes. After the war, Operation High Jump, led by Admiral Richard Byrd, sent thousands of American troops to Antarctica in 1946. Officially, it was for research. Unofficially, some accounts suggest a military encounter, a retreat, and another silence. Byrd's own words in a now obscure interview mentioned enemy aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole in moments. Technology. That shouldn't have existed. Why say that? Why bury it? The Antarctic Treaty remains one of the most unbreakable pacts in modern history. In a world torn by war, trade, and politics, somehow this one place is off limits. No drilling for resources, no exploration without clearance, no explanation needed. Why? Could it be that Antarctica is not empty, but full? Full of memory, full of evidence, full of things that would rewrite everything. What if the ruins of a pre-Ice Age civilization lie under the ice? What if something sleeps there, old, vast, and unfinished? And what if the world's most powerful nations already know? Secrecy is easy when the land itself is inaccessible. When storms guard the truth. When freezing temperatures erase footprints. But technology is catching up, and the questions are growing louder. Not just among fringe theorists, but among geologists, climatologists, scholars who whisper of inconsistencies, of anomalies, of gaps too wide to ignore. Why does Google Earth blur parts of Antarctica? Why are some maps redacted while others show geometric shapes impossible to explain? Why does so little information come out? And why is what does come out always so bland? Science thrives on discovery, but here curiosity dies in the cold. Maybe we're not ready. Maybe we're not supposed to be. Because what lies beneath that ice doesn't just challenge history, it threatens control. Over narrative, over memory, over belief. If we knew, truly knew what was buried at the bottom of the world, would we still believe this is the first time civilization reached for the stars? Or would we remember that once long ago we already touched them? Beneath the soil, beneath the stone, beneath the story we call history, lies another world. Not metaphor, not myth. A literal world, carved, hollowed, hidden, and no one really knows who built it, or why. Derinkyu. It sounds like something whispered in a forgotten dialect. And maybe it was. Because what lies beneath the plains of Cappadocia in modern-day Turkey defies more than just logic, it defies narrative. A city underground, not a basement, not a shelter, a city, with room for 20,000 people, livestock, kitchens, wells, schools, churches, ventilation shafts, even a massive rolling stone that sealed the entrance from within. 20 levels deep, cut through volcanic rock with no smoke marks, no soot, no chaos. Clean, planned, engineered. Who were they hiding from? We are told it was for protection, from invaders, from war. But no army of the ancient world could possibly justify this kind of effort. You don't move entire populations underground for a raid. You don't dig miles of tunnels just to wait out a battle. You do it when the surface is no longer safe. So the question echoes what was happening above. The region is full of these underground cities. Kaymakli, Uzkonak, dozens more, some not fully excavated, others sealed again after discovery. Some connected by long, narrow tunnels designed not for carts or warriors, but for quiet passage, silent movement, escape. And that detail haunts the silence. These cities were not meant for expansion. They were not places of growth. They were places of retreat, temporary or generational. What kind of cataclysm forces an entire civilization beneath the ground? Some point to climate, volcanic winter, solar flares, earthquakes, all plausible, all devastating, but none explain the sheer scale, the architecture, the intention. These were not panic burrows, they were sanctuaries, and perhaps not the first. In Ecuador, the Tayos caves stretch deep into the earth, natural formations modified with sharp, deliberate lines. Legends speak of a metal library, of strange artifacts pulled from the darkness then hidden again. Neil Armstrong visited, not as an astronaut, as an explorer. Why? What did he hope to find underground? And in China's Gansu province, pyramids rest not atop the land, but sunken into it, overgrown, swallowed, as though someone wanted them forgotten. Again and again, ancient people seem to build downward. In Malta, the hippogriff of Hal Saflieni descends layer after layer into the limestone, chambers carved with precision, an acoustic oracle room that amplifies sound in unsettling ways, and bones, so many bones, but curiously, skulls with elongated features, studied, then lost. All through history we dig up. But what if the real story is down? Even the oldest mythologies speak of inner worlds. The Greeks called it Hades. The Hindus named it Patala. The Norse told of Svartalfheim, land of the hidden ones. The Hopi remembered it as the place of emergence where they once lived before coming to the surface after the last cataclysm. Why is below always a place of power? Not hell, not damnation, but refuge, rebirth. Maybe the ancients weren't running from something demonic. Maybe they were preserving something sacred. Maybe the surface was never the beginning. Modern science mostly avoids these questions. Archaeology explains Derinkuyu with chisels and time, but no one really knows how it was lit, how the air remained fresh, how entire populations could live without sunlight, without going mad. And yet, they did. And when they left, they sealed it behind them. Some say these cities were much older than we're told, that the Hittites didn't build them, that even the Phrygians only found them, that the true builders were forgotten on purpose. Because to remember them would be to admit something terrifying, that we are not the first advanced culture to fear the sky. What if in some long-forgotten era, the surface became uninhabitable? Radiation, asteroids, a solar catastrophe. Something that forced entire civilizations to vanish beneath the earth not for weeks, but for generations. What would they have become? What would they have learned? And what stories would they leave behind when they finally emerged? Some believe they didn't, that a few stayed, that they evolved differently, that the legends of Inner Earth are not allegories but fragments of memory, that Agartha Shambhala and other whispered names are not myths but misunderstood coordinates. The Nazis searched for them, the Soviets too. Expeditions to the poles, seismic scans, disappearances, all cloaked in silence, because the truth beneath our feet may be far stranger than we're ready to admit. Not aliens, not monsters, just others, survivors of something we forgot, or were made to forget. So when we look at daring Kuyu and marvel at the stone and the scale, we must also ask, why was it sealed? What were they hiding? And more hauntingly, what if they knew we'd forget? There is a face staring at us from the jungles of southern Mexico. Broad, stoic, carved in basalt. The face does not speak, but it remembers. These colossal heads, some 9 feet tall, weighing tens of tons, emerge from the earth like memories no one asked to recall. They belong to the Olmecs, a civilization older than the Maya, older than the Aztec, older than the versions of history we are comfortable with. And yet, we rarely speak their name. The Olmecs are called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. But if that's true, then who mothered them? Their writing is undeciphered. Their origin is debated. Their decline is a mystery. They appear in the archaeological record fully formed with advanced calendars, ceremonial centers, and mathematics, then fade into ambiguity, as if someone had pressed delete on their chapter. Why? Look closely at the stone heads. They do not resemble the local population. The features, flat noses, full lips, wide faces, are not easily explained. Some have argued they show African traits, others Polynesian. Theories dismissed often angrily as fringe or racist. But the truth is simpler. They are different. And difference disturbs narrative. Because if the Olmecs were connected to distant peoples, if their features reflected a forgotten migration, then history once again must bend. Mainstream archaeology offers no definitive answer for how the Olmecs moved 40-ton stones across jungle terrain without the wheel, or how they aligned their ceremonial centers with celestial events, or how they encoded Venus cycles into their myths before telescopes ever existed. We're told it was primitive intuition, trial and error, coincidence. But the monuments say otherwise. Atlanta pyramids rise not as tombs, but as symbols. Underneath buried caches of jade, serpentine, and magnetite, materials charged with spiritual meaning, arranged in patterns that seem less like offerings and more like messages. To who? To us, or to someone they feared would return. Magnetite. It appears again and again, a naturally magnetic mineral, used by the Olmecs in compasses, perhaps, used in ceremonial masks. Was it symbolic? Was it functional? We don't know, because we stopped asking. The Olmecs disappear from textbooks almost as quickly as they appear in the archaeological timeline. Their cities are overgrown, their artifacts boxed away, their language never taught. And when they are mentioned, it's as a prologue to the Maya, a footnote to the Aztec, as if their presence is inconvenient. Because it raises the question, how did they know what they knew? There are carvings, glyphs we don't understand, hinting at flood myths, sky visitors, celestial calculations. And yet we're told to move on. There's no time to dwell on what doesn't fit. But it's in the not fitting that the real story often hides. Consider the ceremonial site at San Lorenzo. It features advanced drainage systems, water channels, engineered terraces, all before the classical age of Rome. Who taught them hydraulic engineering? Who taught them geometry? Where did their knowledge go? And why didn't it pass on? The Maya developed their own systems. Yes, but even they seemed to look back toward the Olmecs, as if they inherited something or were haunted by it. And yet, there's no direct transition, no slow evolution. The Olmec world vanishes around 400 BCE. No war, no natural disaster, just absence. And in that absence, a gap. A silence too symmetrical to be natural. In that silence, theories bloom. Some say they were decimated by plague. Others that their elite simply merged into newer cultures. But others believe they went somewhere else, not across the land, but into secrecy, into shadow. That they took what they knew and buried it, not just physically, but culturally, spiritually, encoded in myth, disguised in ritual, and perhaps scattered through trade or through bloodlines. Because here's the thing, Olmec influence appears in places it shouldn't. Symbols, building styles, cosmologies echo across Peru, Colombia, even parts of North America. A shared language of memory, muted but persistent. Could they have been part of something larger? A network, a remnant? And if so, who dismantled it? Spanish conquest, maybe, but the decline happened long before that. So what are we missing? In recent decades, satellite imagery and LiDAR scans have revealed dozens, maybe hundreds of buried Olmec-era sites. Roads, canals, foundations, covered by jungle, masked by time. But the funding for excavation dries up. The reports fade. The results rarely make headlines. Why? Because to dig too deep into the Olmecs is to disturb the entire historical framework of the Americas. To admit that we don't know where they came from, or what they knew, or why they left. And when a culture leaves without explanation, without war, without famine, without fire, it suggests choice. It suggests they chose to vanish. So we must ask from what or from who? Were they hiding or protecting something? There are stories told in Nahuatl, in Zapotec, in whispered oral traditions of ancient people who walked with the gods, who built with stones that could move themselves, who remembered the world before the flood. And when the sky changed, they disappeared, not in fear, but in purpose, to keep something safe. So maybe the stoneheads of the Olmec aren't just art. Maybe they are markers, sentinels, memories, not of who they were, but of who came before, and who might one day return. Somewhere in the barren hills of southeastern Turkey, a mound rose quietly above the plains for thousands of years. Just a mound, dust, grass, time, unassuming. And then diggers came. They peeled back the soil, and beneath it they found a circle. Not just a circle, many. T-shaped pillars rising from bedrock, carved with animal symbols, strange, abstract forms. Some were 20 feet tall, some weighed 10 tons, and all of it was ancient. Göbekli Tepe, estimated to be over 11,000 years old. That's 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids, before writing, before agriculture, before what we're told is civilization. So, who built it? And why did they bury it? Because Göbekli Tepe was deliberately covered, packed with debris and backfill, as if someone wanted to preserve it or hide it. entire circles sealed in earth like sacred time capsules. Archaeologists called it a temple, a ritual center, but no bodies were found, no homes, no tools, just stone and silence. We're told it was built by hunter-gatherers, nomads, people with no cities, no social structure, no engineering, and yet they carved and lifted megaliths, aligned them to the stars, created artistic motifs still not fully decoded. What if we've misunderstood the entire concept of primitive? What if they weren't learning to build, but remembering how? Göbekli Tepe sits at the very edge of the Younger Dryas, the time of the Great Flood, the comet impact, the climate catastrophe that reset the world. So what if these circles were not a beginning, but a farewell? A message from a dying culture. Not to gods, but to us. This wasn't just architecture, it was memory-made stone. Carvings of foxes, serpents, birds, headless humans. Some believe they represent constellations, a celestial calendar, a cosmic warning. The vulture stone pillar, 43, has become infamous. It shows a scorpion, a headless man, a ball-like object falling from the sky. Is it myth or history? Researchers from Edinburgh University proposed that it encodes a date around 10,950 BCE, the same window as the Younger Dryas impact. If that's true, then Göbekli Tepe doesn't just predate civilization. It redefines it, because it means someone was tracking the stars, understanding precession recording cosmic trauma thousands of years before the first known kingdoms rose. Who? We don't know. We're not even sure how much more lies underground. Only a fraction of the site has been excavated. Much of it remains untouched, waiting. Or perhaps protected. Some believe that Göbekli Tepe was part of a network, that similar sites lie beneath other hills, other mounds dismissed as natural. Karahan Tepe, Nevali Chori, whispers from the same forgotten builders. But what if these weren't just sites of ceremony? What if they were schools, libraries, observatories? What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't about worshipping gods, but about surviving cycles? If you knew the world would end again, what would you leave behind? You wouldn't write books, they burn. You wouldn't rely on language, it's too fragile. You'd use stone, you'd build meaning into shape, you'd encode knowledge in geometry, you'd bury it where time might forget, but not destroy. Göbekli Tepe is not alone in this logic. Across the world we find structures meant to outlive memory. Petroglyphs in the American Southwest, cairns in Scotland, stone chambers in Japan, always aligned, always whispering something. But Göbekli Tepe is different in its age, and its intentional erasure. Why bury it? To protect it from invaders, or from the weather, or was the knowledge within too dangerous to let loose again? Because power without wisdom is destruction. And perhaps they learned that the hard way. What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe weren't just engineers, but survivors? Refugees from a lost world, passing forward what they could. Not everything. Just enough. Enough for the future to wonder. Enough for the curious to ask the right questions. But not enough to control, because truth without humility becomes tyranny. So they built in symbols, they taught in stone, and then they stepped away. Let the dust cover them, let forgetting begin. Until one day we would return, not as masters, but as listeners. And maybe that day has come. The deeper we dig, the more we see. And yet the deeper we dig, the less we understand. What was once the cradle of civilization becomes only a chapter, a midpoint in a cycle we've barely begun to comprehend. Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly. It is a mirror, a reflection of a world we once knew and chose to forget. Or perhaps were made to forget. So the next time you stand beneath an ancient stone, ask not what it was used for, ask what it was trying to preserve. And whether we're ready now to remember what it never wanted us to lose. Time is not always what it seems. We imagine it as a straight line, a chain of cause and effect, one century following another, clean and knowable. But sometimes time loops, it skips, it folds back on itself. And in those folds, something hides. In the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists once unearthed a curious text, written in cuneiform on a baked clay tablet. Not a myth, not a prayer, but a list. A list of kings. It came to be known as the Sumerian King List. At first glance, it appears mundane, just names and numbers, a sequence of rulers, cities, reigns. But then you notice the math. Some kings are said to have reigned for 200 years, others for 28,800. One Alulim of Eridu is recorded as ruling for 28,800 years. That's not a typo. It's written, repeated, and consistent across versions of the list. We're told to dismiss this as symbolic. A metaphor. The ancients exaggerated. They measured time differently. They didn't mean it literally. But what if they did? What if these kings weren't human in the way we understand? What if they weren't even rulers, but eras, custodians of knowledge, or beings of another kind altogether? The king list divides its chronology into two parts: before the flood and after. Yes, the flood again. That ever-present rupture in memory, the line where time breaks. Before the flood, reigns are impossibly long, grand, otherworldly. After the flood years shorten, dynasties become familiar, history becomes manageable. But that divide the deluge, it's more than a story. It's a reset button, a veil, a wall. Why does every ancient culture describe a flood as the beginning of time? Because before the flood, there was something else. Something inconvenient. The king list names 8 antediluvian kings, 8 rulers of immense longevity, 8 stewards of cities now mostly ruins, mostly forgotten. But it doesn't describe them as myths. It presents them as fact. Historical record, catalogued, measured. If it were just one tablet, we might ignore it, but copies have been found in multiple locations: Nippur, Larsa, Uruk, always with similar names, similar spans, similar silence. And then without explanation, the flood comes. Then the flood swept over. Everything before washed away, everything after rebuilt. But rebuilt by who? Some scholars have tried to correct the numbers. Perhaps the ancient scribes used base 60 mathematics. Perhaps years meant months. Perhaps they were dreamers, poets, mistaken. But these same scribes tracked lunar cycles, mapped Venus, predicted eclipses. They knew math. They knew time. So why in this one record are we asked to believe they were suddenly wrong? Or, why are we so eager to believe they were? Because to accept the king list at face value is to open a door we've kept locked for too long. A door into deep time. Not centuries, not millennia, but ages. The ancient Hindus had the Yugas epics, stretching for hundreds of thousands of years. The Greeks spoke of the Golden Age, when gods walked among men. The Egyptians listed pharaohs before the first dynasty, Shu-Geb, Osiris. Time before time. And now the Sumerians echo the same. So either every culture imagined the same delusion, Or they remembered something we forgot. If these kings existed, what were they? Advanced humans, survivors of a lost civilization, entities not bound by flesh. The Anunnaki gods of Sumer are often said to have come from the heavens. Some texts even describe them arriving with knowledge law and technology. Again, we're told myth, allegory. But when myths persist across continents, across languages, across centuries, they stop being stories. They become fingerprints. So why was the king list preserved? If it was fantasy, why copy it? Why catalog it? Why keep it for generations? Unless someone wanted us to remember, but not too soon. Because the king list doesn't just suggest a forgotten history, it suggests a history intentionally divided, curated, edited. Before the flood long rule, mystery god kings. After the flood, shorter reigns, mortal kings, controllable narrative. Was the flood not just an event, but an act of concealment? A cosmic curtain call. And those kings, those 8 luminous names they erased because they didn't fit the new order. A new calendar. A new world. A world where truth is measured in manageable units. Where no one lives 36 duantones years. Where power is mortal. And if someone engineered that forgetting, what else did they delete? Other texts, other lists, other lifespans. Is that why history begins in Sumer? Because that's the point where the memory rebooted. The Sumerians said their knowledge was given, that they were taught to write, to farm, to govern, not invented, received. By whom? Maybe those first 8 kings were not kings at all. Maybe they were keepers, anchors between worlds, bridges between what was and what would be. And maybe the real question isn't who ruled for 800 years. Maybe the real question is, what truth takes 800 years to forget? Somewhere in the cradle of civilization, the clay tells a story the textbooks do not. Pressed into tablets with reed styluses, left to harden under Mesopotamian suns, the oldest written language on earth speaks in symbols. And within those symbols are names. Not just of kings and merchants, but of beings from the sky. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The name lingers like a shadow, translated roughly as those who came from heaven to earth. Not gods exactly, not men either, something in between. In the ancient texts, they are not mythical. They are administrative. They assign tasks, they build cities, they judge disputes, they instruct, they punish, and most curiously, they descend. They come down. From where? The heavens, we're told. But in Sumerian cosmology, heaven wasn't metaphor. It was a place, a realm. Not divine, but locational. Nibiru some texts mention a celestial body. A crossing point. We don't know what they meant. And perhaps that is the point. Because for centuries these references were dismissed, filed away as mythology, compared to the Greek pantheon, the Egyptian Neteru, a primitive attempt to explain nature. But the Sumerians didn't treat the Anunnaki as metaphor. They listed them by name, gave them domains, described interactions, negotiations, rivalries, instructions. One of them, Enki, is credited with shaping humanity, not metaphorically, physically. From clay mixed with the essence of the gods, to bear burdens, to work, to serve. It sounds like a story, until you ask why the Sumerians, some of the earliest city builders, were already writing about genetic creation. Long before DNA, long before any concept of molecular life. And yet, there it is. Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, tablets from Nippur, Sippur, and Ashur, fragments that echo each other, that suggest humanity was made. By who and why? Maybe it's all just ancient poetry. But then, why does the story repeat? In Egypt, humans are molded by knum on a potter's wheel. In the Bible, Adam is shaped from dust. In Greek myth, Prometheus sculpts man from earth. Over and over the same metaphor, or the same memory. What if the Anunnaki weren't gods in the way we think, but simply advanced? Beings with knowledge indistinguishable from magic, or technology indistinguishable from mythology. Arthur C. Clarke once said any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. The Sumerians wouldn't have known engines, or computers, or flight, but they knew the sky. They watched it. They tracked every planet visible to the naked eye. And they spoke of a time when those from above walked among them. They gave them laws, taught them to measure time, divided the heavens into constellations, mapped the days, the seasons, the orbits. Not guesses, not guesses. Math. The Sumerians counted in base 60. They understood the ellipse of planetary motion. They tracked Venus's retrograde cycles with uncanny precision. And yet we're told they were just lucky, intuitive, lucky guessers. But if they were guessing, who were they quoting? Because even today, our measurement of time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees, is inherited from them. Who told the first humans to use 360 to represent a circle? Who taught them to divide the sky? The Anunnaki are often mentioned in connection to kingship. In the king list, rulership is said to have descended from heaven, not inherited, not elected, but given. Why would that be? Unless someone once held the authority to do so. It's uncomfortable to think about. The idea that human civilization might have help, that we are not self-made, that our myths are instructional, that our gods were once real. Not omnipotent, not eternal, just earlier. But if so, where did they go? Did they leave? Did we drive them away? Did they fade from sight or fade from memory? And is there a difference? Some say the Anunnaki still watch, not from spacecraft, but from within our systems, embedded in bloodlines, in symbols, in knowledge passed down quietly through secret schools, cloaked rituals, guarded archives. Maybe that's why the stories were buried. Not because they were false, but because they were true enough to threaten the new order. You can rule people who think they are alone, but not those who remember they were shaped. You can teach obedience to a species that believes it crawled from dust, but not one that suspects it was forged with intention. Maybe the Anunnaki were real. Maybe they were invented. But either way, their story persists. It persists in ancient stone, in fractured tablets, in whispered names. And if they were invented, the question becomes, why did the Sumerians create such specific beings? Why not speak of wind and storm and sun like other cultures? Why assign faces and functions to architects from the stars? What did they see, or what were they told to remember? And why is no one willing to look closer? Maybe the Anunnaki are just shadows. But shadows always come from something. And maybe they are not the myth. Maybe we are. There are words we can no longer hear, not because they've vanished, but because the key to understanding them was lost or locked away. On the island of Crete, more than 3,000 years ago, a civilization rose like a whisper between the waves. It did not conquer. It did not spread by sword. It danced, painted, built palaces full of color light and strange symmetry. The Minoans, named not by themselves but by us, because their real name has been forgotten. We don't know what they called their gods. We don't know what they called their cities. We don't even know what they called themselves. Why? Because they wrote in a language no one alive can read. Linger, not carved in stone, but pressed into wet clay. A script full of curves and angles rising like delicate reeds from the earth. Over 400 known inscriptions, on tablets, on rings, on ceremonial vessels. And none has been deciphered. Archaeologists tried to crack it, linguists, historians, cryptographers. But it resists translation. It mocks correlation. Every attempt ends in silence. Its successor, Linear B, was eventually solved. Michael Ventris cracked it in the 1950s, revealing an early form of Greek. But Linear A, still mute. How can an entire civilization remain voiceless? Unless it was meant to. We assume all writing seeks to be understood. But what if this one didn't? What if Linear A wasn't designed for trade or record-keeping? What if it was ceremonial, esoteric? What if it was never meant for outsiders? Or what if it was meant for someone else entirely? There's something strange about the Minoans. Their art is vibrant, their cities labyrinthine, their architecture fluid, open, alive. They worshipped a mother goddess, held sacred the bull, built no massive tombs, no war monuments. A culture without apparent conquest. And then they disappeared. Not slowly, suddenly. Around 1450, BCE Minoan sites were abandoned, burned, overwritten by Mycenaean hands. Earthquakes, perhaps. Volcanic ash from Thera, invasion, all plausible. But what if it wasn't just nature, or war? What if someone wanted them forgotten? And not just forgotten, but silenced. Because without a readable script, a civilization can be rewritten or erased. We cannot hear their voices. We cannot know their intentions. We can only guess. And guessing is the space where control thrives. Some researchers speculate that Linear A is related to ancient Anatolian languages. Others link it to Semitic roots. A few believe it predates them all. A language with no descendants. A tongue that simply ended. But languages don't end. They evolve. They fracture, unless something stops them. So, what could have stopped this one? What if Linear A didn't vanish by chance, but by design? We find inscriptions in sacred contexts, ritual cups, votive tablets, ceremonial spaces. Not ledgers, not inventories, but messages. To who? The gods. The ancestors, or perhaps to themselves. Codes passed in circles too closed for time to breach. What if Linear A wasn't a public script, but an initiation language? One understood only by the few. Guarded. Layered. Symbolic. Not writing, but encryption. And maybe that's why we can't read it? Not because we lack the tools, but because we lack the context. We don't think like they did. We don't see the world the way they did. So their language remains closed to us like a door without a frame. And yet, the fragments keep appearing. In caves, on mountaintops, in buried palaces, messages from the sea, echoes of a people whose thoughts we can no longer enter. Unless we're not meant to enter them alone. Unless Linear A is part of a larger code, one not written in letters but in symbols across civilizations. Look closely. Across the world, sacred scripts emerge and vanish. The Rongorongo of Easter Island, the Indus script of Mohenjo-Daro, the Vincha symbols of prehistoric Europe, all undeciphered, all inexplicably sophisticated, all silenced. What connects them? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. Perhaps these were the keys left behind by a culture that spanned oceans, survived floods, and encoded its memory not in stone, but in silence. Because silence cannot be forged, only rediscovered. So maybe Linear A isn't a failure of translation. Maybe it's a test of perspective. Maybe we're not meant to crack it like a puzzle. Maybe we're meant to remember what kind of mind could write that way. One that sees the world in symbols, in cycles, in frequencies, and maybe in vibrations. Some researchers believe ancient scripts were sung intoned rather than spoken, carried on breath, not ink. What if Linear A was not read with the eyes, but with the body? A vibrational key, a harmonic blueprint, a language you feel. Too strange, or too old? And if so, what were they trying to say? Were they leaving a message for us, for the stars? Or were they simply closing the door behind them? One final time. Because in the end, that's what Linear A feels like. A sealed room. Not lost, but locked. And the question that lingers isn't what does it mean? The question is, why was it never meant for us? They were here, and then they weren't. No ruins, no tombs, no grand collapse. Just a void. It happens more often than we care to admit. Entire cultures vanish from the record, as if swallowed by time itself, not by war or famine, but by silence. As though someone pressed delete. As though someone chose not to remember. We call them lost tribes, forgotten peoples, enigmatic. And we shrug. Because history cannot account for what leaves no trail. But what if there was a trail and it was covered? What if disappearance is not an accident, but a mechanism? Think of the Clovis culture, once thought to be the first people in North America 13,000 years ago. Stone tools buried deep beneath layers of earth and assumption. And then, older tools were found. In Texas, in Virginia, in Chile. Sites like Monteverde suggest human presence thousands of years before Clovis, and suddenly the timeline cracks. Who were these earlier people? Where did they go? Why are they not part of the story we tell? Because if humans were in the Americas 20,000 years ago, maybe more, then everything we thought we knew collapses. The land bridges, the migration theories, the pace of progress, gone. And it's not just the Americas. In the forests of the Amazon, satellite imaging reveals geoglyphs, perfect geometric shapes carved into the jungle floor. Circles, squares, causeways, some over 2,000 years old. We were told the rainforest was untouched, that it was too wild, too inhospitable for large civilizations. But what if the jungle wasn't original? What if it reclaimed something? If these shapes are evidence of cities, then someone lived there, thrived there, built in ways we're only now beginning to notice. And if so, where are they now? Gone, without trace, without name, as if someone wanted them forgotten. In Southeast Asia, the plain of jars in Laos holds thousands of stone vessels, some weighing several tons. Who carved them? What were they for? We don't know. Local legends say they belonged to giants. Archaeologists say ritual, burial, but no bones, no writing, no answers. So we move on, because silence is easier than contradiction. Even in the Pacific, the disappearance continues. The Lapita people, seafarers who crossed vast ocean distances, left pottery and DNA trails across thousands of islands. Then they were gone. Replaced, absorbed, erased. The deeper we look, the more voids we find. Civilizations that should have left footprints didn't, or did, and we erased them. But who decides what survives? Who writes history? The victors were told. But what if the victors are invisible? What if there are hands that shape the past, not with weapons, but with ink? Not by burning cities, but by omitting names. In colonial archives, entire languages were misrecorded. Tribes were renamed, redrawn, reframed. Whole histories reduced to single paragraphs. In one version of reality, the Tasmanian Aboriginal people were declared extinct, their language untranslatable, their culture obliterated. But they weren't extinct, they were excluded. Excluded from the map, from the dialogue, from memory. Even now, there are uncontacted peoples living in silence on the fringes of modernity. On islands, in jungles, their stories unwritten and therefore unreal to some. But is writing the only proof of existence? Or is that just what we were taught to believe? Because what isn't written can't be questioned. What isn't archived can't be reclaimed. What isn't remembered never happened. And so forgetting becomes a form of power, a sacred kind of violence, silent, clinical, disguised as progress. But some cultures fought back, not with weapons, but with myth. They buried their truths in symbols, in rhythm, in repetition, in stories that don't make sense until they do. The Dogon people of Mali speak of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye. They say they've known about it for centuries. How they won't say. The Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime holds memories of floods of islands swallowed by rising seas. Geological data confirms these events from over 10,000 years ago. So how did they remember? Because remembering is an act of resistance. When history erases, oral tradition hides. When time forgets, memory whispers. But memory fades, and as the last speakers die, so do the keys. To languages, to maps, to truths that never reached a page. So we are left with fragments, stone circles, pottery shards, genetic traces. Enough to haunt us, never enough to anchor the story. And maybe that's the point, because if you saw the whole picture, you'd have to question your place in it. You'd have to ask, who were the missing? What did they know? Why did they vanish? And what if their silence is the loudest warning of all? There are objects that never make it into museums, not because they're lost, but because they're hidden, tucked in vaults, shuffled into miscellaneous drawers, or simply made to disappear. We imagine archaeology as discovery shovels hitting stone brushes revealing secrets, but more often it's filtration, curation, selection. And the question that should haunt us is who decides what counts? What truths are quietly put back into the ground? Because some artifacts don't fit the narrative. And when something doesn't fit, it's easier to call it a hoax, or better yet, ignore it completely. Take the London hammer. Found in Texas in the 1930s, encased in what appears to be 100-million-year-old rock. A man-made tool wooden handle-iron head fused into prehistoric stone. Geologists argue. Some call it a concretion, others a modern intrusion. But the real story isn't whether it's authentic. It's why we're not allowed to ask. Why does every anomaly trigger panic instead of curiosity? In 1851, a metal vase was dynamited out of solid rock in Dorchester, Massachusetts, claimed to be over 500 million years old. Ornately carved, shaped like a bell, reported in scientific journals. Then forgotten. In 1961, miners in Oklahoma extracted a spark plug from a geode, a man-made object inside a mineral formation that should have taken thousands of years to form. Dismissed as coincidence, filed away, vanished. Over and over, the same cycle: discovery, ridicule, erasure. But who's doing the erasing? Is it just academic defensiveness, the inertia of consensus? Or is there something more deliberate at work? Imagine a room somewhere, locked, no windows. Inside, shelves lined with boxes, each box marked unclassified, unverified, inconclusive. Inside those boxes, objects: a coin from a time before coinage, a lens too precise for ancient hands, a sculpture of a creature no one remembers. They say the Baghdad battery is just a curiosity, but why does no one talk about the missing ones? The Smithsonian Institution, one of the world's most trusted repositories, has been accused time and again of suppressing artifacts. In the late 19th century, there were reports of giant human skeletons uncovered across North America. Newspaper clippings, eyewitnesses, measurements, then silence. Bones were allegedly sent to the Smithsonian, but they're not in the records. Were they misidentified, or were they hidden? And if so, why? What kind of history requires the burial of its own evidence? One that's fragile. One that only survives by pruning the tree of time, cutting off any branch that dares grow in a different direction. We trust institutions to protect the past. But what if they're curating the illusion of it instead? Not lying exactly, but simplifying, cleaning the mess, hiding the noise. Because real history is not linear, it's cluttered, chaotic, uncomfortable. And objects, real, tangible objects, are hard to explain away. So they vanish. In Peru, stones were discovered in the Ica region, hundreds of them. Smooth black rocks carved with images, telescopes, open-heart surgery, extinct animals. Too strange to believe. Too many to dismiss. They're now labeled fakes, even though many were found decades before tourism. Even though locals tell stories of their great-grandparents discovering them in caves sealed untouched. But once the forgery label is applied, the discussion ends, even if the truth is more complicated. Why are we so quick to condemn the anomalous? Why does every out-of-place artifact become a threat? Perhaps because objects carry weight. A story can be debated. A theory can be revised. But a thing must be dealt with. Its presence demands explanation. It holds space in reality, and that space is dangerous, because it forces us to ask, if this is real, what else have we missed? And that question leads to more, to gaps, to inconsistencies, to the places no one wants to look. Like the tunnels beneath the pyramids, the sealed rooms of the Vatican, the satellite imagery that never loads. What else is out there? What else has been found and hidden? We want to believe that knowledge flows upward, that the more we learn, the closer we get to truth. But what if knowledge flows in circles, and some circles are closed? What if entire chapters of history are being stored not in public view, but in secret archives? Not to protect us, but to protect the structure. Because if the wrong artifact reaches the wrong hands, a paradigm crumbles. And those who benefit from the current paradigm will do anything to preserve it. So the next time you walk through a museum, ask yourself, what's not on display? What's in the basement? What was never written about because it didn't fit? What object was slipped back into the soil and left for time to erase? And what if just once someone decided not to bury it? What if the truth was held in a hand examined and kept? Not by a scholar, not by a king, but by someone like you. Someone who knew that some things should not be forgotten. Symbols outlast empires. Long after kings have crumbled, after languages have turned to dust, after cities have been buried beneath forest and sand, symbols remain. Etched in stone, woven into cloth, drawn in firelight and pigment. And what's strange, what no one can quite explain, is how many of them are the same. Across oceans, across millennia, across cultures that never, according to history, met. The spiral, the serpent, the eye, the swastika not as a political mark, but as an ancient solar symbol, the labyrinth, the world tree, the winged disk, the stepped pyramid, the hand with a dot in its center, the cross within a circle. Why, we're told these are archetypes, patterns hardwired into the human mind, that all cultures, when left to their own devices, stumble across the same shapes. But is it really that simple? Because some of these symbols are not intuitive. The Dogon people's complex diagrams of Sirius, the cosmic wheels of Vedic mandalas, the Mayas' obsession with the underworld tree. What if they didn't all discover these symbols? What if they remembered them? Fragments of a language older than writing, a visual code carried forward through collapse. Not just art, but data. If we saw a computer chip on a cave wall, we'd recognize it as artificial. But what if the ancients had their own chips? Not of silicon, but of symbol. The serpent, for instance, it slithers through every mythology. In Egypt, it coils around Ra's solar bark. In Mesoamerica, it's Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. In India, it becomes the kundalini, the coiled energy at the base of the spine. In Norse myth, Jormungandr circles the world. In China, the dragon a serpent with power over wind and water. Different names, same shape, same reverence. Why? Some say the serpent represents DNA. Double helix, coiled, alive, something the ancients couldn't possibly have known. Unless they did. Or unless the serpent represents something else entirely. A force, a presence, a pattern. The eye another universal. Eye of Horus, third eye of Shiva, the all-seeing eye in the pyramid. Sometimes it watches, sometimes it opens, sometimes it judges. But it's always there. And the question isn't, why did they use the eye? The question is, why did they never stop? Even cultures separated by continents painted the same symbols on cave walls, the same spirals, the same grids, the same shining beings with large heads and radiating lines. Coincidence? Maybe. But coincidence doesn't carve itself into every sacred stone across the planet. And then there's the tree. The world tree. Axis Mundi, Yggdrasil, the tree of life. It stands in the center of mythologies as a ladder, a bridge, a connection between realms. Roots in the underworld, trunk in the middle world, branches in the heavens. So who taught everyone to see the world like that? Who planted that tree in every consciousness? And what happens if we follow the roots? What we find is a web. A network of symbols repeating in places too far apart to share language. So maybe language wasn't the medium. Maybe they didn't need ships or maps to communicate. Maybe they dreamed the same dream. Or maybe there was a time when the world was smaller. Not geographically, but spiritually. A time when all people came from the same source. A mother civilization, long gone, but not forgotten. Not entirely. Its monuments lie in ruins, its names are erased, its stories survive only in whispers. But the symbols remain, unbroken, carried forward, like seeds on the wind. Carl Jung called them archetypes, but even he admitted they may have come from something deeper. A collective unconscious. A memory before memory. What if symbols are echoes? Not inventions, but impressions. What if the serpent, the spiral, the tree, the eye, are all we have left of a language we didn't speak with mouths, but with minds? Or with something older than minds? What if the ancients didn't invent meaning? They translated it, interpreted a frequency, saw geometry where we see abstraction, built in patterns because those patterns are embedded in us. And the cover-up. It's not that the symbols exist. It's that no one asks why. We label them, we catalog them, we display them in museums with neat little plaques. But we don't see them. Not really. Because to see them is to realize we are not original. We are recurring, a loop, an echo, a copy of a copy wearing the same signs as those before us without knowing why. And that's what makes the symbols dangerous. Not their shape, but their memory. They remember. They connect. They lead somewhere. And maybe, just maybe, they lead back to the first storytellers. The ones who didn't need words. The ones who left their truths not in books, but in signs. Waiting for someone to look again. Imagine a hallway. Not in a palace, not in a temple, but in the deep architecture of time itself. A long corridor, walls etched in languages you almost recognize. Symbols that stir something in your chest, but vanish the moment you try to name them. You walk slowly. There is no rush, because you've been here before. Somewhere beyond memory, beyond lifetimes, you have walked this path. Every step echoes, not in sound, but in recognition. You pass fragments, faded murals of cities swallowed by sand, statues buried upside down. A scroll turned to ash mid-sentence. A whisper that once was a name, but now is only vibration. These are not relics, they are reminders. And the deeper you go, the quieter it becomes, until even your breath begins to sound borrowed. There are doors on either side of you sealed with no handles. You do not open them. You are not meant to. Not yet, because you are here for something else. At the end of the corridor, there is a mirror. It is not made of glass, not metal, not stone. It is stillness. You don't see your reflection. You see a child sitting in the dark, drawing circles in the dust. A shepherd tracing stars with his finger. A woman humming in a forgotten tongue. A man kneeling before a monument too old to question. You see hands building fires, shaping clay lifting stones. But they are not strangers. They are you. Or perhaps what you were before the forgetting. And suddenly all the anomalies, all the impossibilities, all the serpents and suns and subterranean temples, they're not pieces of a puzzle. They're footprints. Yours. Left behind, just in case? In case the silence grew too loud. In case the veils grew too thick. In case the dream became too deep. You lean closer to the mirror. And for a moment, only a moment, you see something else. Not a face, not a figure, but a spark. Tiny, timeless. The part of you that never forgot. And it asks no question, offers no answer. It only flickers. A single pulse, a breath. And then, darkness. But not the kind that hides, the kind that waits. Because maybe we were never meant to solve the mystery. Maybe we are the mystery remembering itself piece by scattered piece. Not to find certainty, but to find presence. To stand among the ruins not as tourists, but as echoes, returning. not to conquer, not to expose, but to listen. And if you listen quietly enough, you may hear it too. The sound beneath the silence, the rhythm beneath the stone, the story that was never written because it was always living. Some truths are not told, they are carried. In gesture, in dream, in instinct. And when the time is right, they return.